Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today's Tuesday, September 30th, day 725 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid, and diplomatic correspondent Lazar Berman joining me from Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with me, fellas.
Thank you. Good morning.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be with you.
It is always a pleasure to have both of you with me at the same time. And in a dramatic joint press conference at the White House last night, U.S. President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu laid out some of the 20 points of the Trump plan for, quote-unquote, eternal peace in the Middle East with the U.S. president as head of the, quote, Board of Peace. We'll also learn about an unprecedented apology that was delivered by the Prime Minister to Qatar and a plan for a trilateral security mechanism between Qatar, the U.S., and Israel. All of this and assuredly much, much more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent Lazar Berman and U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. So, Jacob, before we get into the content of the Trump peace plan and how it diverges from the draft we spoke about earlier in the week, let's just set the atmosphere inside the White House. Especially, it seemed to me, at least as I was watching the live stream, there was an extremely long wait before the two leaders appeared. So tell us how it was inside the White House.
Come to think of it, I don't know, I kind of am used to sitting and waiting most of my time when we're there for these trips. And I'm trying to review in my head all four that we've had this year. And I would say that what was unique about this one was that there wasn't the rush into the Oval Office to try to ask questions to President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. This time they had the bilateral session in the Oval Office, private and closed to press. I do believe that one of the other four did as well, but then there were other opportunities to ask them questions. I think one of them also, they had the February meeting, which was, I believe, the first one. That was where Trump announced about his plan to take over Gaza. So there was a press conference there similar to what we had on Monday. But this time the press conference ended. I don't know if you want to even call it a press conference because it ended without any questions, which is pretty rare for President Trump, who quite enjoys taking questions from reporters. Maybe this was an agreement that the two of them reached. The reason that they had given when Trump was saying why we're not going to take questions is that we're trying to keep everyone on board and we don't want to risk saying anything that would harm that. It's never been something that stopped President Trump in the past from wanting to speak. But maybe this is something that Netanyahu wanted, or maybe I think there's some speculation that the meeting didn't go perfectly in the White House and that maybe they wanted to just limit the interactions with the reporters at the end of this very sensitive day.
It was really interesting being on the live stream, of course, because there was a bit of a hot mic with our Minister Ron Dermer, and he was making all sorts of jokes throughout. And then as the entourage from the U.S. walked in, finally, J.D. Vance and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and others, he said, "Here come the big guns," all sorts of things like that. And so it seemed to the viewer, at least, that the atmosphere was pretty calm. I don't know if it's a fake it till you make it kind of moment, but it was very interesting to see that for sure. Now, Lazar, when you were, we were all watching this, but when you were watching it, did you notice anything different this time than the other three trips you've been on this year?
Well, I think the length of President Trump's statement, it really went on for a long time, and you compare that to how relatively brief Netanyahu's was. It looked like Trump really, really wanted to, say what he wanted to say and took his time and embellished in a very Trumpian fashion. And Netanyahu, had to hit the certain points, but he wasn't there, to really expand on it. And he really didn't seem like he wanted to be there any more than he really had to be. And let's keep in mind, this was kind of a unique trip because, especially for the Israeli journalists, there was no briefing on this trip. So we were supposed to be briefed. It was either going to be in New York City at the UN, and that got pushed back. They said it would happen in D.C., and then that got canceled, I guess, and it didn't happen. And of course, Netanyahu cleared his schedule yesterday afternoon before this meeting. He was supposed to have a public appearance canceled that. So, to me, that's really an indication that he understood that he really had to prepare for this meeting, that he had to make sure he knew what he wanted to say, that he couldn't just stroll into it. If you remember, in April, there was that trip to Hungary, and then Trump kind of last minute invited Netanyahu to Washington, and Netanyahu said, "Oh, sure, we'll go. I'm sure it'll be like the February meeting." And he really walked into something of an ambush there, and he was surprised on three fronts. So I think he wanted to make sure that didn't happen again, and he really wanted to make sure that given the number of important areas where what Trump was saying was not what Netanyahu wanted to see, and he really had to make sure that he was able to thread the needle here. He wanted to make sure he was prepared. And given the results and what Trump said in the end, it looks like Netanyahu managed to get through this. And the question is, what happens with the implementation? But all in all, I think it's a pretty positive result for Israel.
Now, as most people know, this week is Yom Kippur, and there is a spirit of making tshuva, of apologizing to those you have wronged. And I guess our prime minister, the head of the Jewish state, was taking that to the very public forum in his very public apology to Qatar. So, Jacob, can you tell us about this apology?
Yeah, if you recall, this has been something that Qatar has been trying to demand from Prime Minister Netanyahu for the past several weeks, since I believe the strike took place on September 9th, so about 3 weeks ago. And since then, Qatar has kind of just pulled out of its mediation efforts and basically conditioning its return on some sort of Israeli apology. And basically that's what they seem to get. And I think it was pretty surprising, because just given the way that Netanyahu has talked about the strike since then, saying it was a success, that even if it didn't end up actually killing Hamas's senior leadership, that it did send this message. And now he's basically walking that back to a degree and saying, actually, we won't do it again, is one of the things he tells the Qatari prime minister in this call that's orchestrated by Trump. And B, that he regrets wasn't intending to encroach on their sovereignty, didn't want to kill this Qatari security guard that was also caught in the line of fire, along with the lower level Hamas people that were killed. So I guess in that regard, it wasn't expected. But on the other hand, if you recall, years and decades back, this isn't the first time Netanyahu has apologized to prominent Arab leaders. There's one apology to Jordan after the failed assassination attempt on Khalid Mashal in the 90s, I believe. And then in around 2013, I think it was, with the flotilla from Turkey, Obama organized a phone call with Erdogan, and Netanyahu apologized then as well. So this has happened before, but I think just given the toxicity of the issue of Qatar and Israel, I don't think it was very well received, definitely from Netanyahu's coalition partners, who are very, very critical, namely Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. But also beyond that, I think it was something that the opposition also jumped on, saying, look, you're not even apologizing to the families of the hostages for what's happened on October 7th, but you're apologizing to Qatar. Explain that for us. So that, I think, it exposed him to some criticism. But on the other hand, it was something that Trump demanded. And it seemed like it was it's what allows the sides to move forward and try to maybe get Qatar back in this business, to maybe be able to pressure Hamas. I think there's a little bit of I don't know the word's excitement, but an assumption that now Qatar is just going to enter the game and simply bring Hamas to its knees to agree to what Israel wants or what Trump wants. But I think that Hamas is still, to a degree, independent, and I'm not sure simply Qatar being in the game will mean that Hamas is going to capitulate.
Another player that I personally hadn't seen for a while, Qatar, as you said, stepped out for a bit, is Jared Kushner. And Lazar, do you have any idea what his role is in all of this right now?
He's been working behind the scenes, especially on envisioning what the day after would look like. He was actually, certainly in that meeting, the expanded meeting with the two sides and their advisors. You could see him in those pictures. So he's been critical in working the Arab world and trying to drum up support for what, this agreed upon day after plan would look like. Of course, he was very, very instrumental in the first Trump administration in an official capacity, especially in getting those Abraham Accords together. But now he's, behind the scenes, and now is certainly more prominent in terms of thinking about what the day after will look like. and getting that onto paper and drumming up support from Arab leaders around the region. I want to just stress how significant this diplomatic achievement is for Trump. Even, let's just say that this plan doesn't necessarily pan out, but just to get, at least at a declaratory level, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who leads a right-wing coalition, and Turkey, right, led by a Hamas supporter and fierce Israel basher Erdogan, and countries like Pakistan and Qatar, which is problematic in its own right, Jordan, which of course has a long-standing peace treaty with Israel, but part of that is it blasts Israel every time he gets in front of a microphone, that they all agree on a vision for the future of the Gaza Strip, and one that is something that certainly doesn't meet any of Hamas's demands, and envisions Hamas basically giving up and releasing all the hostages. I think that in and of itself is a very, very significant diplomatic achievement, and it's hard to imagine how many other world leaders can you imagine to get all those people, all those countries on the same page? That's pretty remarkable right there. Of course, the question is what happens now. What does Hamas say? They can't outright reject it, and that's not how they've been handling proposals in the past. They generally say something positive. They'll probably come back with some reservations, some changes they'd like to see, try to buy some time, try to gauge how much support they have in the Arab world for some of their positions, see if they can get more international pressure to build on Israel, see if they can get any domestic pressure, see if they can find some sort of cracks to drive a wedge through. But of course, the more time that goes on, and the more Trump is really putting his weight behind this proposal, the less and less maneuver room they have. So I think they really understand that their room for maneuver is getting smaller and smaller. But the question is, how are they going to react? I don't think we're going to see them just throw up their hands and give up. They'll try to maximize what they can, but that's becoming less and less as time goes on, and this certainly is not a good day for Hamas.
Okay, and since we're already talking about reactions, Jacob, just fill us in on the reactions from the Palestinian Authority and, of course, Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Sure. On the PA side, they kind of echoed if there was also this joint statement that was issued by the 8 countries that Trump met with last week on the UN sidelines. There were 8 Arab and Muslim countries. The Muslim countries that were more interesting were Pakistan and Indonesia. And I guess Turkey you could include in that as well. And then the usual Arab countries, I think Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Apologies if I'm missing one of them. So they talked about welcoming Trump's efforts to advance an end to the war in Gaza. So they were very careful not to say we welcome this plan specifically. They talked about elements of the plan that they liked, but I think the edits that Netanyahu managed to get into the plan over the past few days, I think were ones that they weren't so comfortable with. And as a result, I think that maybe explains the decision to simply welcome the effort as a more general policy and express willingness to try to implement parts of it. And then the PA does the same and says, reacts to, I think, Trump's point during his speech at the press conference where he talks about the need for the PA to reform. And the PA responds in its welcoming statement saying, look, we are reforming, and it lists some of the things that it's committed to doing, some of the things it's already done. So that's the PA and Islamic Jihad, which is notable because they are holding some of the hostages. For them to come out already and say that they think that this plan will ignite the region, and don't support it is pretty notable. On the other hand, I think Hamas does have a pretty large degree of control over the other terror organizations that are holding hostages in the Strip, namely Islamic Jihad. So if Hamas does come on board, I would expect them to be able to get Islamic Jihad to do the same, but it's obviously not a good start when that organization is saying that it's against it.
Let's go to a short break. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid and diplomatic correspondent Lazar Berman. Now, let's go through parts of the speeches, Lazar, and some of the quotes that jumped out to me, other than, of course, the incredibly accurate pronunciation of Abraham, which is so elegant. Some of the quotes that jumped out to me are, of course, the way it's being branded by Trump. It's being branded as eternal peace in the Middle East. It's a big, big day, a beautiful day, potentially one of the great days ever in civilization. And I don't think he's speaking in hyperbole, just, as we say here in Israel, stam. He really means it from the heart that this is a very significant moment. So what are you seeing here, Lazar?
Yeah, so there were many elements of the speech that were peak Trumpiness. There was one point where he was talking about the world leaders he worked with. And for some reason, he goes, they all seem to be men in my experience. He just throws in things like that. And then
I did notice that, Lazar, I have to say.
And then he went off on that Abraham. For some reason, he decided to try to kind of imitate the way it's said in Hebrew. But that shouldn't get in the way of what he really means here. The fact that he's talking about the greatest day in the history of civilization ever means that he's not just looking at the end to the Gaza war. He, and I think correctly, is using this as a mechanism or as leverage to jump to a transformation of the region, and using that same momentum now that he has everyone around the same table, right? Now that he has regional leaders who just want to end the war in Gaza, that's what they're focused on. He's saying, okay, if you want to do this, then you're going to sign on for something after, and that includes moving toward more normalization with Israel. That's what he's looking toward, right? And he's even talking about, let's forget about Iran. He talked about Iran maybe joining it, but he's saying there's no limit to how far I'm envisioning it. And he's hoping that this end to the war and this kind of feeling of relief and the fact that he has everyone behind him, now he can start pushing forward and forward. And the fact that they're going to work together on Gaza and they're going to have to work with Israel and through Israel, and then he's going to try to get some of those processes that were stalled in the region. Probably not the Saudis immediately, but you can think of a country like Indonesia, moving somewhat quickly. And then you can even think of countries, smaller countries in the region like Oman or Kuwait or even Qatar to make some moves as well, all those before Saudi Arabia. But that's what he's thinking. And you see how effective he is in speaking to leaders, getting them on board, getting everyone to feel that at least a lot of their concerns are being met and everyone gets to kind of interpret it the way that they want. That's effective. So there's a lot of potential here. I don't think people should get too excited too quickly. But in terms of, really changing the regional dynamics, this is as good a chance as any. And of course, what's going to be the key here is, first of all, solving this Gaza fighting and then making sure that the positive momentum that comes with winding that down is actually taken advantage of. So there is some reason for optimism here, but of course, this being the region and a lot of it depending on groups like Hamas, we have to temper that optimism with some realism.
Right, and Trump definitely recognizes the iffiness of Hamas being on board or Hamas actually implementing the plan. He says if they're unable to do so, then Israel would have the absolute right and actually our full backing, the U.S. full backing. I have a feeling that we're going to have a positive answer, but if not, as you know, Bibi, you'd have our full backing to do what you would have to do. Jacob, how is that playing out in the U.S.? Is that being picked up at all?
That specific line, I don't know if I've seen that. Looking a little bit of scanning of press, that's not something I saw. What I noticed in his remarks was actually weighing into Israeli domestic politics a little bit, where he talks about how he's noticed these protests in Israel. I think he notices them because they're talking about him. The protests often have these massive signs appealing to Trump himself and saying, only you can bring this deal. We want to end the war, bring back the hostages, and only Trump, you can do this. And he talks about these protests and notes that it's actually quite domestically popular. Netanyahu, he turns to him and says, for you to take this deal, I get that you're this warrior and that you want to keep fighting, but it's time to take this deal. Almost to be recognizing Bibi's political situation, but pushing back on, I think, maybe his inclinations to not want to take this deal. I thought the other thing that was noteworthy is that he made a point to, I think this is something that Netanyahu even asked for during their private meeting, was to recognize publicly that Netanyahu is opposed to the establishment of a Palestinian state, What's notable, though, is that he recognizes this, but doesn't necessarily say that he agrees with it. Because if you look at the plan, it talks about establishing a potential pathway to a Palestinian state. Now, it's a variable. The Palestinians are getting something in credit when Israel's getting a lot more in cash in this deal, but it's still in there. And Trump's obviously, that was what I was hoping to ask Trump about, if he's basically simply recognizing or agreeing, but there wasn't an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this press conference. So I'll try to catch him another time. But I thought that was something that stood out to me.
I thought, listening to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, number one, that he looked kind of more pale than he generally does, perhaps sensing the storm that he will face when he returns to Israel. But I thought his words were very measured, as usual, and he spoke extremely positively about this plan, much more than I had anticipated. Lazar, what was your feeling about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's remarks?
So first of all, I just want to react to your question that you had to Jacob about giving Israel that stated permission to go back to war. I think that's very important. I think if we want Hamas to understand that their time is up and they need to, give in and release the hostages and let Gaza move to something else and let the region move to something else, they have to understand that there's no hope. And when you had, the previous administration talking about stopping Israeli operations, around Rafah, the fact that Trump said this and said, if you don't accept this, then I'm not going to try to stop what the IDF does. I think that's very important. That's really understanding what the dynamics are here. In terms of Netanyahu's reaction listen, he understood where he stands. He has put all of his eggs in the Trump basket. And you especially see that now that all of his other allies in the Western world, all the major ones or most of the major ones are recognizing a Palestinian state, calling for the war to end and continue to accuse him of starving Palestinians. So he can't alienate Trump or else he's got no one left. So certainly standing next to him, he has to assent to the plan and give his consent. But also, this is really an opportunity for Netanyahu because, listen, I was not optimistic that the military plan itself, even though they're moving into Gaza City, was going to force Hamas to give up hostages anytime soon. Of course, Hamas doesn't want that operation to move forward, but you didn't see signs that Hamas was cracking or that it was, ready to throw up its hands. So it could have been months until that operation finished in Gaza City, and then they moved toward the central camps, and Hamas would try to get all sorts of ways to stop for 60 days with the hope that Israel couldn't stop itself. So this actually, kind of gives Netanyahu a pathway to say, okay, I agree to it. If this happens, then we won the war. We get the hostages out at the front end, which I don't think would have happened in any other scenario. And then he can start, he's got elections coming up. So he can even say, I got the victory and maybe I got another country or two to join onto the Abraham Accords. So if Netanyahu, I think, is, thinking big picture, he can say, I'm not going to worry so much about some of the parts of my coalition that have gotten in the way of me, doing some of these bigger things in the Middle East. And I can actually focus on driving forward. If he needs to, he can just kind of say, Trump made me do it. And then he could get into the election season in a very different position than he would have been if this war was dragging on, if the hostages weren't out. If he still obviously wasn't going to annex, then he wouldn't have pleased anybody. And he would have been going into an election as the prime minister who was in office when October 7th happened. And he was still in office when hostages were still held in Gaza and Hamas was still kicking. So this I think gives Netanyahu an opportunity to really change what had been a pretty bad summer for him, especially in the last couple of weeks.
Yes, I hear everything you're saying, and especially about the Abraham Accords. Lazar, let's pronounce it correctly now. Jacob, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say that I think I was taking a look at the version that was published by the White House on Monday versus the one that I got a hold of last week. And there were some pretty important changes that I think Netanyahu managed to secure regarding specifically the demilitarization of Hamas, specifically on, for example, the issue of amnesty for Hamas members, that they will only be granted the amnesty if they actually turn over their weapons. That's a new clause that was added. There's more explicit, it's as opposed to before, there was this vague commitment that is required for Hamas to hand over its weapons or destroy its weapons. Now it's simply they will destroy all their weapons. So I think that was something that Netanyahu demanded. And then more critically, I think, is on this issue of withdrawal, because the new version talks about having the ISF, this new international stabilization force, meeting benchmarks before Israel agrees to hand over territory in Gaza to them, or Hamas disarming weapons or destroying its weapons, all of its weapons in Gaza and the infrastructure in Gaza before the IDF pulls out of different areas. And then there's also this security perimeter that isn't mentioned in the original plan that's talked about, that Israel will be, that this will exist. And Netanyahu makes a point in his remarks on Monday at the press conference of talking about that for the foreseeable future, we're going to be maintaining a security perimeter and overall security control over Gaza. So I think there were a lot of things that Netanyahu managed to secure during his meetings. He had two very lengthy meetings with Witkoff and Jared Kushner over the past few days following his UN, or before and after his UN speech, that I think Bibi got a lot of what he might probably wanted on those issues. And why I also mention it is just because I spoke with an Arab diplomat from one of the mediating countries after the speech, and they said, look, we welcome it, of course, but this is going to be a real uphill battle, because we're asking Hamas to give up all the hostages up front, which is all of its leverage, when there's this very staged withdrawal, and this plan that the White House introduced on Monday. It comes with this map that actually goes way more into Israel's favor regarding how much of the territory in Gaza can remain in before it has to pull out gradually in 3 different stages. And the Arab diplomat just felt that this is going to be something that's going to be hard to get Hamas on board, and didn't sound very optimistic. And what he did say definitively is it's going to be several days at least until we have an answer. I think there's going to be a lot of deliberations trying to get Hamas leadership abroad on the same page as Hamas in Gaza, which is sometimes known to be as more extreme, but I think they're generally aligned on broad principles. So there's still a lot of work to go. But I think that obviously there were a lot of the fact that you have all these Arab countries on board to try to push Hamas along is something that will be very helpful.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. There's still a lot to discuss, and I'm sure we will in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by Adina Karpuch. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.